Hot topic at the moment, negative gearing.
It always seems to come up.
It's reared its ugly head again.
I don't really give a fuck.
Investors are a dirty word. Property investors are greedy.
Investors are fucking national heroes, mate. The reality is we've got a huge amount of renters. There's not enough homes. The country is pretty much fucked at the moment. If negative gearing was totally removed, what would happen to investors and what would happen to the housing market? I'm thinking of my kids' generation. 43% of the cost of that home are government taxes. I think it's really a scary point. The impact on the housing crisis is much longer than 4 years.
Hey Cam, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
No problem at all, Cam. Hot topic at the moment, negative gearing.
Negative gearing has been huge in the news recently. It always seems to come up when any mention of an election happens, doesn't it?
I don't want to dwell this episode on what is negative gearing, but through your platform, Oz Property Guy, you put a post out recently, I think got 1 million+ views across the platforms.
Yeah.
And you sort of did a really quick snapshot, what is negative gearing? So let's do a really quick snapshot, deep dive into that now, and then we'll move on to the topic of the day, which is what's happening with negative gearing.
So what is negative gearing? If I've got expenses of $50,000, I have income of $40,000, I've got a loss there of $10,000.
Yep.
Let's say Kate has that situation. She earns $100,000. She can take the $10,000 loss, put it against her $100,000 of taxable income, and she is then taxed at $90,000 taxable income. So that's the very basic concept of negative gearing.
Yep.
Make sense?
Makes sense to me. So just to really simplify it a step further, so Kate would have been taxed ordinarily on 100,000.
Yep.
She's taxed now on 90. So $10,000 isn't taxed for her. She'll make a saving of what she would have normally paid tax on there.
Correct. So it's not a $10,000 gain she's got back. She's just taxed on $10,000 less.
And it's a tool that most new investors going into the market utilize negative gearing in a way to help them with the cost of a property.
Yeah, so negative gearing, the Australian Tax Office, ATO, deemed that nearly 95% of people who claim negative gearing earn on average $87,000. So this is the standard person on the street is utilising negative gearing.
I thought it was the fat cats.
The fat cats, the big dogs.
I thought it was the big dogs who are maximising the benefits.
Yeah, no, the fat boys don't use it.
Okay. So I know when I started investing in property, absolutely needed negative gearing.
Yeah.
The first property I got, because of the benefits you just said for Kate, the government pays a bit for it. So quite simply, 3 people are paying for your property. You've got your tenant paying for it.
Correct.
You've got government paying for it through tax breaks, and you're paying the little slither of what's left in between.
Correct.
And I think most people who are first-time investors absolutely need to rely on those 3 aspects, so that they're not putting their entire pay packet towards funding a house.
Yeah, so I think if we talk about, I want to talk about a couple of things. So why do we have negative gearing? How it would, if some of the conceptual changes the government have proposed, how it would impact the housing crisis, which we've got currently. And a crisis is chronic, so it's over a long period of time. And this is, the government set up the Housing Supply Council. So this is an independent body to address the long-term crisis we've got in housing. So the government don't set up independent bodies to tackle problems that are short-term. They know the country is pretty much fucked at the moment with its housing. Let's get to it. So I want to talk about negative gearing. If it was removed, how it impacts investors, how it impacts the housing crisis. And I think that's the crux of what I want to get into today.
And so we're talking about that today because the government came out recently after losing the unlosable election.
Oh, the Bill Shorten unlosable election?
Yeah,
that's
because he said we might pull negative gearing off the table, and everyone thought that was gone and put to bed and in a coffin and never to be seen again.
Yeah.
But it's reared its ugly head again recently in the media with them saying, I don't think the government said we'll consider it, but there's certainly talk of it's not off the table anymore. Yeah,
and I don't want to get into political sides, but because I think all politicians are absolute shonks. They only think about 4 years in advance. They'll say anything to get into power. They don't care about the government long-term or the country long-term. And I'm being very cynical here. So I don't want to get into politics of which side's better, but I want people to understand why the government come out and say specific things. It's literally to get votes. The impact on the housing crisis is much longer than 4 years. And that's what we're going to get into. So I've actually got a different take on it. I think negative gearing should be changed. So I'll just put that out there on the table to start with, and I'll talk about later exactly why.
Okay, so as the government said, we're looking at it, we're considering it, we're removing it, or just it's on the table for discussion?
It talked about curbing negative gearing. Last time they talked about in the Bill Shorten unlosable election, they talked about the removal of negative gearing. They really screwed people there. They also brought that in of saying they were going to mess with people's superannuation. So they hit two major streams of society, and that's why he lost the election.
Franking credits were going to go. There's a
credits.
whole range of things that were going to screw everybody.
Correct. Now, Louise in our office, she came out this week and said there was a change to negative gearing in 1987. And she asked me and said, look, in this podcast, do you mind giving a bit of an example of how that affected your personal portfolio in 1987? I was like, what? Was I born in the fucking 1920s? So I had to explain to her that I was born in 1974. And although I started investing young, by 87, I didn't quite have a portfolio at that stage.
So I was in the meeting too. Thanks, Louise. But they did, as Louise correctly alerted us to, they did do it in 1987. They did a trial run of this, removing it, abolishing it,
well, it wasn't a trial
scrapping
run.
it.
Yeah, it wasn't a trial run.
They did it.
They removed negative
How long did it
gearing.
last, Kim?
Last about 18 months. In a book that I wrote during COVID, Investing in the New Normal, I actually went back over all the major impacts to the property market and economic markets over the last 35 years, and that was one of them I addressed in that. The actual details of why they removed it, why it was reintroduced, and the stats clearly show the reason it was reintroduced is because the impact to investors was immediately felt. Investors over the next 12 months jacked the rent ups dramatically, and it was the renters that were screaming at the government saying it's now unaffordable to rent properties. So the government reintroduced negative gearing to give a tax break to investors, which then lowered the rents that that landlords were charging, and the economy kicked on again.
People selling their properties?
Yeah, they
in
were.
droves?
Yeah, they were. They were selling their properties in droves, which there was obviously the impact of the housing market. So the investors were getting out. There wasn't now. Investors don't make up a large portion of the market, so there wasn't a lull in the housing market because investors were selling. But the reality was that the impact was felt immediately.
So some of the push at the moment is coming from people saying rents are increasing rapidly, property investors are greedy. Let's get rid of negative gearing, get some investors out of the market, and it'll be fairer for all.
Yeah. So I agree with parts of it, and this is where I'm probably more controversial than most property investors who just say, give me everything and let me plow ahead with life, and wealth and greed is good. I've made my money. I'm thinking of my kids' generation and how they're affected in the housing market and their kids. So that's become more important to me nowadays than me just earning enough wealth to handle what Felicity and I need for our retirement. So when you start looking at things long into the future, which is why I brought up the government don't do that, is that you can start looking at what economical changes will mean to the housing market and the housing crisis. So if we think about what brings supply and demand, so this is the basic formula of why the prices go up and why rents go up, is we've got a huge population growth, the immigration coming in. The reason the government need this is basically with the debt to GDP, gross domestic product, it's topped up at about 40% through COVID. They're not going to pay that back. So the way they pay that back, or they get that percentage of debt to GDP down, is by growing the economy. The only way to grow the economy, and this is one in investing in the new normal again, I look back at the 1950s on what happened after the Second World War. And after the Second World War, the debt to GDP was 120%. So in the media during COVID, everyone was carrying on about the debt. I don't really give a fuck, because I looked back and went, it was 120% after the Second World War. What did the government do? They had huge immigration come in. Immigration means people go to work. They then pay taxes. That drives the economy, and the gross domestic product to debt is reduced. And that's what they're doing now. They're bringing huge amounts of immigration in to reduce the debt to GDP. Now, what happens to the housing market when you bring in huge amounts of immigration and you're not building enough? Because we're building 27% below the 10-year average now for building home starts than we were 10 years ago. So that we're 27% below 10-year average. So we're not even building enough homes for now, let alone the impact of the immigration coming in. So I want to get to negative gear and how this impacts.
So can I ask one question there? So to bring that back to a micro level, and they're big global Australian numbers you've talked about with GDPs and things like that.
Yeah.
And I'll use an example of my first property, and I think this can align to what you're saying. So I think what you're sort of saying is you allow economic growth to take care of the debt.
Yep.
I bought a property, my first one,
Yep.
for 120,000. Sounds like not a lot, but this was 20 something years ago now, and it's relevant now in terms of median house price. So
It's closer to 30 years
but,
ago.
what,
You're getting older, mate.
early 20s. So I bought the property with an 80% gearing.
Yep.
I did interest only,
Yep.
and I did interest only for 20 years.
Yep.
Every 5 years,
Every
I rolled
5
it
years,
back
roll it
over.
over.
So
Yep.
interest only. Now, after 20 years, I sold the property and it sold for 650,000. It still had 80% debt on it.
Yeah.
So the economic growth meant my gearing was 20% and not
Correct.
80% or whatever the number
Yeah.
is. And what you're saying is the economy and the GDP can do the same.
It's exactly right.
Bring migration in,
Yep.
grow the workforce, grow the economy.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, the debt
The debt
levels will
percentage.
be insignificant because we've got a bigger economy.
You've nailed it. That's a really good way for people to understand the debt level to gross domestic product is the same as a property. If the value of the property goes up, the percentage of debt comes down. Same with the economy to GDP. Grow the economy and the debt level comes down as a percentage, which is why people freak out. We're at 40%, or it's below that now, but
Yeah, and I think because we understand property, we've seen that, we can look at what the government did through COVID and go, debt's high.
Because,
What did you
yeah.
say it was, 40%? Or
pumped up to 40%.
it's not enormous, but you grow the economy, that becomes insignificant because
Correct.
the
Yeah.
economy is growing around it.
That's right. To pay that back is they can't do it. So let's have a look at what happens to the property market while we're bringing the immigration in. The reality is we've got a huge amount of renters, potential renters, needing a place to live, people needing to buy homes. There's not enough homes, so the property prices go up and the rents go up, which is what's happening, even fighting against the interest rates that the RBA are pushing up. So but the economy's cranking again now, so interest rates look like they're coming down. Everyone's predicting that. But what happens and why would they be bringing a curb to negative gearing? And this is where I think the change should happen. And some investors would go, you're mad. With investors, about 80% buy existing properties. 80% of investors buy existing properties. If you were to remove negative gearing and grandfather it, and grandfathering being a term that means that
Thank you.
anyone who had negative gearing on a property, that remains in place.
So I buy one the day before the election.
Yeah.
Election happens, I already owned it.
Yeah.
I'll continue to get the benefits of negative gearing.
Yeah. This is my policy. This is vote for Cam.
Camo one.
Yeah. Make Australia great again.
Cam 25.
Yeah, that's it. Not Kevin 07, Cam 25.
Cam 25.
Yeah. So we bring in a change to negative gearing, hypothetically that, and let's be really clear here. The government are not getting rid of negative gearing. They screwed it up in the 80s and it was reintroduced. Probably one of the biggest fuck ups of government economically. Bill Shorten lost the election based on this sprouting of removing negative gearing. They're not going to remove negative gearing, but I want to see a potential change, and I think it would be good for investors and good for our kids in the future. And that is, if you were to remove negative gearing, grandfather it for existing properties, and allow negative gearing only for new properties. So building new properties then increases the amount of supply in the market.
So let's just unpack that quickly, because a massive problem at the moment, and I think there's a big build project of let's build 800,000 homes over the next 5 years.
Yeah.
The government's nowhere near their targets.
1.2 million. There's got fucking
So,
no chance. In the
so
world
what you're
of
saying
doing
is allow negative gearing to stay,
And look,
but you've got to do a new home.
Yeah, I'm saying yes.
So it solves another problem. That's the question I've got. So
Yeah.
it solves the problem of not enough houses are starting,
Correct.
to going, we'll start more houses because more investors want houses.
Yep.
And a little of a sidebar here, but sometimes investors are a dirty word.
Yeah. Oh,
But
yeah.
in my mind,
Big
it's not popular. It
big
serves a
greedy
purpose because there's always going to be people who need rentals. 20-year-olds can't buy a house.
Correct.
Some people never get a deposit.
Yep.
There'll always be a need for renters. Social housing, there's a 10-year wait in
Yep.
some states.
Yep.
2 years for critical social housing.
Yeah.
We need housing.
All right.
Investors do a favour to the world, to the government, provide housing for some of those people.
Investors are fucking national heroes, mate. No, let's look at it in reality without joking. Let's look at it. If negative gearing was totally removed, what would happen to investors and what would happen to the housing market? Because those two things need to be looked in parallel.
Scrapping abolishing it.
Abolishing it. Let's look at it and go, what would happen if it was abolished? So what happens is there's more immigration coming in, so more demand coming in. But the cost to hold an investment property goes up for an investor, and we're talking about this is tough because, as you and I know, we don't use negative gearing. We've got our portfolios are positive. Anyone with a decent portfolio has had it for a period of time doesn't use negative gearing. So fat cats don't use it. You've put on a bit of weight.
Fat cat.
But if we look at if it was removed, the average person, as I said before, the ATO deemed that they're on about $87,000 per year. So it's a school teacher. It's like it's real people that are utilising negative gearing to buy one, maybe two investment properties because they know superannuation isn't enough. So they just want to set themselves up retirement. And while they hold that property, they can rent it out to someone who needs it, who can't afford to buy a property. The second they remove negative gearing, that tax benefit is not there. The only way to make it feasible to hold that property for that average Australian is to increase the rent, which is what happened in the 80s, is to increase the rent a dramatic amount. That then makes it unaffordable for the renters. So the renters scream. What the landlords then do, the investors, is they go, I'm not buying any more investment properties. So the builds of the 20% who build new drop, which means there's less houses in the market, which pushes the prices of housing up because there's still more immigration coming in. So not only does it screw the investors, it screws the average Australian because the rents go up and the house pricing goes up. So people think, stop helping out the rich people who get negative gearing changes and it'll make it more affordable. It doesn't work that way. It's exactly the opposite.
So who provides the housing then? If us property investors don't,
Yep.
and this scenario happens,
Yeah, all right.
people can't afford to hold it.
Yep.
10-year wait for social housing currently,
Yep.
and everyone's going to live somewhere.
Yeah, right. So
what happens?
And this is what I studied a lot overseas. You know, I love getting into my what happens in the economies overseas.
I know.
So the closest similarity to the Australian housing market is the US. They're like our big cousin in a lot of things, economically.
Hats. Bigger hats.
They got big hats, yeah. A lot of cows. What's happened? So this is the alternate. No negative gearing in the States. What they have is a thing called rent-controlled housing. So rent-controlled housing means that the government builds housing en masse in areas, and they reduce the rent, and they jam all the renters in there. So we didn't want
ghetto,
and they call them ghettos. You've all seen the movies of the ghettos. They're lovely places. We'd love that. Imagine going, all the renters in Australia are substandard. We're going to jam them into ghettos. We didn't want that in Australia. And that's the beautiful thing about Australia is we didn't want this segregation of population where there's the haves and the have-nots. So the government did it really smart by creating negative gearing, which allowed investors, like everyday Australians, to provide a rental property next door to their own home, not literally, but in the areas where they live, and renters can live amongst homeowners as opposed to being big sections of homeowners and big sections of renters, segregating the population, putting the man putting the finger on the have-nots and saying you live in the shithole ghettos, and the crime rates and everything that goes along with that. So Australia's done it really well. People need to look at the alternate and go, you know what, negative gearing, you're getting ghettos. That's what's happening. So
what people probably don't realise is, we'll take the inner city regions of most capital cities away, but if you go suburbia, probably 25 to 30% of all houses mixed in those suburbs are renters.
Yep.
And that's a hard and fast rule around most of the country. And that's what you're saying there. So we don't want a massive contamination of all these renters in one spot.
Correct.
We spread them out. We make a good society.
That's right.
We make a livable city.
Exactly.
And that's what seems to work.
And that's why Australia's the way we are. Do you know what I mean? Like the population lives. I was a renter once. You were a renter once. We lived next to homeowners. Didn't cause too much trouble.
Well, that's sort of my point. Like, I look at it and go, they're trying to get rid of negative gearing, and investors are a dirty word, but people in their 20s need rentals. Single people need rentals. Lots of different people across society need rentals. I don't know why it's a dirty word that investors are trying to provide housing for these people. And the talk of getting rid of negative gearing seems to me that everyone's going, oh, well, that's no good. We don't want you here. But we're serving a purpose.
I got asked to go on the ABC recently and had a chat to them and went through that. And thankfully enough, they listened to it and they liked the concept and understood that we don't want ghettos. And they actually liked it when I said remove negative gearing and only put it on new housing. You know what I mean? But at least they were open to that concept as opposed to just saying all investment's bad. So let's think about it. If we are an investor, so why do you invest though? So what's the reason for someone investing and taking advantage of negative gearing? Because it's not smart to spend $1 and get 50 cents back.
No.
So no one wants to use negative gearing who's an investor, because you're not making money off it. You're paying money and you're getting half of it back, thereabouts. I'm being general in tax. But if you're doing that, you're investing for growth. So what we obviously do for clients is, if you're investing for growth, you need to have a strategy, which we use the market area property strategy, to find investors the best property. So knocking out capital cities are not good for investment at that point in time. Then finding those growth corridors, and that's what the analytics team do. Look for those growth corridors that have limited supply on housing, but a high future forecast population growth going to those areas, which that's what you want as an investor. So you don't mind copping negative gearing for a couple of years if you know the population growth into that area is going to exceed supply and therefore push the housing prices up, because then you get obviously that growth. So there's no use taking advantage of negative gearing if you don't have a set strategy to get the most growth out of the investment you're going into. So don't just go around the corner and buy a property to get negative gearing. It's ridiculous.
So if I look at this, right, and I'm an average investor with one property.
Yep.
And the vast proportion of property investors have one property.
Yep.
I'm currently relying on the government to provide me 5,000 or 10,000 in tax breaks to help afford the property. The government says it's gone.
Yep.
Example. I'm left with two options. One doesn't work. One is put the rent up, but the market tells you what the rent is.
Yep.
So what in reality, I sell the property, gone.
Well, if you
so then the rents ultimately go up.
Well, no, yeah. If the government, and this is what happened in '87, the government got rid of it, and over the next 12 months, any lease that came up, the landlords pushed the price up to a point where it was feasible to hold that property. So
the tenants don't need to pay it though. The tenants can say we're not paying it.
Well, they couldn't, because there was nowhere else to live, because every landlord was pushing the price up.
And I've got on my slide pack from our producer what the rental vacancy rates are. So they're under 1% around the country.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like,
so there's not a surplus, a glut of rentals.
Well, that's what I mean. There's a housing crisis. There's not enough houses for renters. There's not enough houses for home buyers. But yet the government is considering changes, which is going to reduce the amount of builds that are happening. Hence the reason why I think it should be changed and negative gearing provided on new builds only, which would encourage investors to build more and help out with the housing crisis. They also should, let's be honest, there was 53 tax changes brought in.
Victoria.
Yeah. 34 of those were on property. So they're increasing. So on a standard 4-bedroom home built, so we're talking not a large home, standard 4-bedroom home, 43% of the cost of that home are government taxes. So if they want to reduce the cost of housing, get rid of some of the taxes. Go and work harder as a government to get your money elsewhere, as opposed to hitting the housing market, which is making it harder for everyday Australians. So it's not the tiny amount that Kate earning $100,000 a year gets as a tax break. It's not the $3,000 tax break that she gets, or $5,000 tax break that she gets, which is hurting the housing market. It's the 43% taxes that start out with the farmer who sells his land to the developer, and the developer gets taxed to the hilt when he's trying to deliver the land, to then break it up and pay the taxes to sell those blocks of land, to buy, mum and dad buys those, and then the builder has all his taxes on it and all his costs, and then every component of that house is taxed with, walls, white goods, everything is taxed. So 43% is taxes. That's the cost of housing. But the government's got an option. If you want to reduce housing and make it more affordable, look at yourself. Work harder. I'm sorry for being savage on taxes, but Kerry Packer did get that right. They don't spend money well, do they?
Look, I tend to agree with everything you've said there, because I was amazed 3-4 weeks ago when there was this renewed talk of negative gearing. And we had a chat at the time. We're like, surely they're not talking about political suicide again like they did last time and digging a bigger hole.
Yeah.
But bring in something like you're saying, where if I'm the government, and we've covered it here already, I've got a problem. My problem is not enough houses are started.
Yep.
So doing something like you're saying and saying, well, you know what, I'll give those who help us achieve our targets a reward, being negative gearing.
Okay.
They're helping us new houses, which accommodate to the immigration. They're helping us to house people. And in return, we'll give them negative gearing and we'll help them provide that housing for us. I think there's real merit to it.
Yeah, I don't, and just predicting, I don't think the Labor government will make the changes to negative gearing after losing the last election on it. I think it's really a scary point. I think they like dangling it around, because what they've got to look at when they're doing a campaign is some people over here like the idea of getting rid of negative gearing, if I wave the carrot a little bit, but not too much, because I don't want to annoy these people over here. So the government are playing this sitting on the fence strategy at the moment when it comes to trying to get votes. And that's what they're doing. I don't think they're going to make any changes at all.
Yeah, I agree. So for those of you who heard at the start, Oz Property Guy, there's a section on there, if you go and look at his Instagram or TikTok, about negative gearing. This has been a great chat, Cam.
Nice.
Thank you. Covered some good topics.